When we speak of the Bible, many approach it merely as a religious text, an ancient book filled with stories, commandments, and poetry. But to the depth psychologist, to one who studies the currents of the unconscious, the Bible is far more than that. It is a vast symbolic map of the human soul. Within its parables and prophecies, its psalms and visions, lie the archetypes that have guided humanity's inner journey for thousands of years. It is a mirror in which our collective unconscious has been projected, shaped, and refined. The battles, the exiles, the revelations, these are not only historical events, they are psychological realities that every human experiences in some form. The Bible speaks the language of dreams, of symbols, of myth, and thus it addresses the deepest layers of our psyche. To understand the Bible is to understand not just God, but the very structure of our own soul. When we approach the Bible from a psychological perspective, we begin to see it not simply as a historical or theological document, but as a vast repository of archetypal images that reside deep within the human psyche. Carl Jung's theory of archetypes, those universal, primordial patterns that exist in the collective unconscious, allows us to interpret the Bible in a way that transcends denominational boundaries. In this light, the creation story, the Exodus, the Psalms, the Gospels, and the apocalyptic visions all become living representations of inner processes that are as relevant today as they were thousands of years ago. The figures in the Bible are not just historical individuals, they are also manifestations of eternal roles within the human mind. Adam is not merely the first man, he is the archetype of humanity's innocence and the beginning of Eve is not only the first woman, she is the embodiment of curiosity, the instinct to explore, and the spark that ignites consciousness through choice. The serpent is not only a tempter, it is the archetype of transformation, the shadow force that challenges us to grow by confronting our limitations. In Genesis, the garden is more than a geographical location, it is the archetypal image of the original unity between humanity and the divine, between consciousness and the unconscious. The act of eating from the tree of knowledge is not simply disobedience. It is the psychological moment when humankind becomes aware of duality, good and evil, life and death, self and other. It is the beginning of individuation, the process Jung described as the journey toward wholeness, where one must encounter and integrate all aspects of the self, even those that are hidden or feared. The expulsion from Eden mirrors the experience of every human being who moves from the innocence of childhood into the complexity and responsibility of adulthood, carrying the longing for that lost harmony while navigating the trials of a divided world. The flood narrative with Noah, the ark, and the rainbow can be understood as a deep symbolic drama about renewal, destruction, and the rebirth of the soul. The waters that cover the earth are not only physical but also represent the overwhelming forces of the unconscious that threaten to dissolve the structures of the ego. The ark becomes the symbol of the inner container, the psychological strength and faith that carry us through overwhelming emotional experiences. The rainbow that appears afterward is a symbol of integration, the reconciliation of opposites, and the restoration of connection between the divine and the human after a period of profound transformation. In this way, the biblical story becomes a reflection of the universal pattern of descent into chaos and emergence into a higher order, a pattern that appears in countless myths and is lived out in individual human lives. The archetype of the hero, central to both mythology and Jungian psychology, is also deeply embedded in the Bible. Figures such as Moses, David, and Jesus embody the journey of the hero called to a great task, tested through trials, confronting inner and outer adversaries, and ultimately bringing transformation to themselves and their people. Moses' journey from Egypt through the wilderness to the Promised Land mirrors the journey of the soul from bondage in unconscious patterns, through the painful process of self-discovery, to a vision of wholeness and freedom. His encounters with God on Mount Sinai can be seen as moments of contact with the self, the central organizing archetype of the psyche that represents totality and the union of conscious and unconscious. The prophets, to embody archetypal roles, they are the visionaries, the truth-tellers, the carriers of the divine message who challenge the complacency of the collective. Their visions and symbolic acts Ezekiel's wheels within wheels, Isaiah's coal touching his lips are rich with images from the collective unconscious, serving as reminders that transformation often comes through confrontation with what is strange, numinous, and unsettling. In Jung's view, these prophetic encounters represent moments when the deeper layers of the psyche break into consciousness, often in ways that disrupt ordinary life but ultimately lead to a broader and richer understanding of reality. Shadow archetype, those aspects of ourselves we deny, repress, or project onto others, finds expression in the Bible. Characters like Pharaoh, Jezebel, Judas, or Herod represent more than just historical villains. They embody the dark forces within the human psyche that resist change, cling to power, or betray trust. These figures are necessary in the biblical drama, for they challenge the hero, reveal hidden motives, and force the individual or community to confront their own inner darkness. Jung understood that wholeness is not achieved by rejecting the shadow, but by acknowledging and integrating it. The Bible's honest portrayal of flawed individuals alongside saints and prophets reflects this truth. The wisdom literature of the Bible books like Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job speaks in the language of archetypes as well. Job's suffering and confrontation with God represent the archetype of the suffering servant, the one who endures trials without clear explanation and is transformed by the process. This archetype is universal, found in myths from many cultures, and speaks to the human experience of enduring hardship as a means of spiritual growth. Ecclesiastes, with its reflections on the cycles of life, touches on the archetype of the sage, the one who sees beyond the illusions of permanence and finds meaning in the rhythm of existence. The Psalms, with their raw emotional range from despair to exaltation, give voice to the archetype of the worshipper, the human being in relationship with the divine, expressing every shade of feeling without censorship. This honesty resonates with the psychological truth that transformation requires us to face and express our authentic emotions, not suppress them. The fact that these songs have been prayed and sung for thousands of years demonstrates their deep resonance with the human heart and their alignment with the structures of the psyche. In the New Testament, the figure of Jesus embodies the archetype of the self in its fullest expression, a unification of divine and human, conscious and unconscious, light and shadow. His journey from baptism through ministry, crucifixion, and resurrection mirrors the individuation process, the calling to a higher purpose, the confrontation with the shadow in the wilderness, the sacrifice of the old self, and the emergence into a transformed state. His parables speak in symbols that bypass the rational mind and speak directly to the unconscious, inviting transformation through inner recognition rather than external compulsion. The miracles of Jesus can also be seen as symbolic acts of psychological healing, the blind receiving sight, the lame walking, the leper being cleansed, all images of restoring wholeness where there has been fragmentation. The casting out of demons mirrors the process of confronting and integrating disowned parts of the self. The resurrection, the central image of the Christian narrative, is an archetype of renewal that transcends death, pointing toward the possibility of transcending even the deepest suffering through transformation. The Bible's apocalyptic literature, such as the Book of Revelation, is filled with archetypal imagery, dragons, beasts, heavenly cities that speaks to the deepest layers of the psyche. These visions are not merely predictions of future events. They are symbolic portrayals of the inner battle between forces of integration and forces of disintegration, the psychological and spiritual crisis that precedes transformation. Jung noted that such imagery often emerges in dreams during times of great personal or collective change, when the old order is collapsing and something new is struggling to be born. To read the Bible through the lens of archetypes is to see that its stories are not distant, irrelevant tales, but living patterns that continue to play out in every human life. The struggles, triumphs, betrayals, revelations, and redemptions it depicts are not confined to ancient history. They are enacted in our own relationships, decisions, and inner battles. This is why the Bible continues to speak across centuries and cultures. Its language is the language of the soul. When we recognize Adam and Eve, Moses, David, Mary, and Jesus within ourselves, we begin to understand that the Bible is not just a record of God's dealings with humanity, it is also a map of the inner journey toward wholeness, a journey every person is called to undertake, consciously or unconsciously, in the course of life. When we examine the role of biblical narratives in shaping the collective unconscious across cultures, we are dealing with something far deeper than a single religion's influence. The Bible, with its intricate tapestry of stories, visions, laws, poetry, and prophecy, has not merely been read and studied. It has been lived in the imaginations, rituals, moral codes, and symbolic structures of entire civilizations. For over 2 millennia, these narratives have seeped into art, literature, law, and political systems, becoming so woven into the fabric of human thought that even those who have never opened its pages are shaped by its echoes. Carl Jung understood the collective unconscious as that deep, shared layer of the psyche containing archetypal patterns common to all humanity. The Bible's stories, saturated with these archetypes, have served as a vast reservoir from which cultures have drawn meaning, identity, and orientation. One of the most profound effects of the Bible on the collective unconscious is its establishment of a moral and spiritual framework that transcends individual choice. The Ten Commandments, for instance, are not just religious edicts, they have become symbolic moral anchors, embedded in Western legal and ethical systems. The notion that murder, theft, false witness, and dishonor toward parents are inherently wrong resonates not only because they are taught, but because they tap into archetypal principles of justice and order. These principles, repeated in countless contexts and reinforced by sacred authority, have created deep grooves in the shared psyche, shaping the way entire societies instinctively perceive right and wrong. The narrative patterns of the Bible also inform the way cultures understand human destiny and history. The archetype of the fall and redemption, central to both Old and New Testament, has profoundly influenced the Western sense of life as a journey from innocence, through trial and suffering, toward restoration. Even secular literature, political, rhetoric, and national identities have unconsciously borrowed from this structure. Nations speak of rising from the ashes, of redemption from past wrongs, of journeys toward promised lands, not realizing they are echoing biblical themes embedded in the collective mind. The influence of biblical archetypes extends to the way cultures interpret leadership and authority. The king as shepherd, the prophet as truth-teller, the priest as mediator. These archetypal roles are etched deeply into human consciousness through repeated biblical imagery. David's kingship, with its combination of warrior courage, poetic sensitivity, and moral failure, becomes a template for understanding the complexity of leadership. The prophet's role, embodied in figures like Elijah or Jeremiah, creates a cultural expectation that there must be voices willing to confront power with truth, regardless of personal cost. These patterns continue to influence not only religious leaders but also the way people perceive political figures, artists, and reformers who step into similar roles. Another dimension of the Bible's shaping influence lies in its use of symbolic geography. The wilderness, the mountain, the sea, the city, the promised land. These are not mere locations, they are archetypal landscapes of the human soul. The wilderness becomes a place of testing and transformation, whether for Israel wandering for 40 years or Jesus fasting for 40 days. The mountain becomes the place of divine encounter and revelation, as with Moses on Sinai or Jesus during the Transfiguration. The sea becomes a symbol of chaos and danger that must be crossed with faith, while the city can represent both human achievement and human corruption. These symbolic associations have not remained confined to religious interpretation. They have influenced the metaphors of poets, the visions of artists, and the imaginations of explorers. The Bible also imprints collective imagery of the sacred and the profane. The tabernacle and temple, with their layers from outer courts to the Holy of Holies, create a psychological image of gradations of holiness, of moving inward toward the presence of the divine. This spatial symbolism has informed the design of churches, cathedrals, and even secular buildings, where movement from public space to inner sanctum mirrors the movement from the outer to the inner self. The destruction of the temple, recounted with such grief in Scripture, becomes not only a historical memory but a cultural archetype for the loss of the center, the breaking of unity, and the longing for restoration. The messianic archetype, so central to the Bible, has also left an indelible mark on the collective unconscious. The figure of one who comes to deliver, to set things right, to bring justice and peace, recurs in both religious and secular visions, whether in the form of historical leaders, revolutionary movements, or even fictional heroes. The expectation of a redeemer is a pattern reinforced by centuries of biblical prophecy and fulfillment narratives. This archetype has the power to inspire hope but also to lead to disillusionment when projected onto flawed human beings who cannot embody the perfection of the ideal. Even the apocalyptic imagery of the Bible has found a lasting home in the collective unconscious. The visions of Daniel, Ezekiel, and Revelation, with their beasts, trumpets, seals, and cosmic battles, have shaped the way cultures imagine ultimate endings and new beginnings. These images surface in art, film, political movements, and social predictions, often stripped of their theological context, but still carrying their symbolic power. They provide a language for speaking about crisis, transformation, and the emergence of a new order from the collapse of the old. The Bible's parables and wisdom sayings have also become part of the deep cultural vocabulary. Phrases like prodigal son, good Samaritan, by the skin of your teeth, and to everything there is a season are used far beyond their original contexts. Yet they retain the archetypal resonance of the stories from which they came. The prodigal son speaks to the universal themes of alienation, repentance, and reconciliation. The Good Samaritan carries the archetype of compassion across boundaries. These phrases activate shared images in the mind, creating instant understanding across diverse groups, precisely because they draw on archetypes familiar to the collective psyche. The shaping of the collective unconscious by the Bible is not limited to Western or Christian-dominated societies. Through centuries of trade, conquest, migration, and translation, biblical narratives have interacted with and influenced other religious and cultural traditions. Islamic literature, for example, incorporates many biblical figures and stories, though in different forms. African, Asian, and indigenous cultures that encountered the Bible through missionaries or colonial systems often blended its archetypes with their own, creating new symbolic languages that still carry biblical resonance. The Bible also plays a role in shaping collective dreams and visions. Jung observed that in times of crisis, individuals often dream in images that resemble biblical scenes, even if they are not consciously familiar with Scripture. This suggests that the Bible's stories have penetrated so deeply into the human, symbolic storehouse that they emerge spontaneously when the psyche seeks to communicate profound truths. The flood, the Exodus, the crucifixion, the apocalypse, these are images that carry psychological weight, precisely because they have been reinforced over generations as symbols of transformation, trial, death, and rebirth. The moral and existential questions raised by biblical narratives also shape the way societies wrestle with meaning. The problem of suffering as explored in Jung, the tension between justice and mercy in the prophets, the paradox of strength through weakness in the life of Jesus, all these patterns shape philosophical and ethical discourse, even outside explicitly religious contexts. They influence the questions we ask about life's purpose, human nature, and the possibility of transcendence. The Bible's shaping of the collective unconscious is reinforced through ritual and repetition. Festivals like Passover, Easter, and Pentecost do more than commemorate past events. They reenact archetypal patterns of liberation, death, and resurrection, and spiritual empowerment. These patterns sink deeper into the shared psyche with each repetition, ensuring that the symbols remain alive and accessible across generations. Art and music further embed these patterns. Michelangelo's frescoes, Handel's Messiah, countless hymns and spirituals all act as carriers of biblical archetypes into the emotional life of the community. Even when societies turn away from overt religious practice, the archetypes remain. Secular movements may replace God with abstract ideals, yet the underlying narrative structures creation, fall, exodus, redemption, apocalypse. They guide the way we tell our personal and collective stories, the way we imagine progress and decline, the way we frame struggle and hope. In this sense, the Bible's role in shaping the collective unconscious is not a matter of belief, but of psychological inheritance. It has given form to the deep patterns by which we interpret existence itself, patterns that operate whether or not we acknowledge their biblical origin. When we approach the Bible through the lens of psychological interpretation, its symbols cease to be merely decorative elements of ancient storytelling and become dynamic gateways into the depths of the human psyche. Carl Jung emphasized that symbols are not arbitrary creations of the conscious mind. They arise spontaneously from the unconscious and carry within them the energy of transformation. In this sense, the Bible functions as a rich symbolic tapestry, in which every image, object, and event can be understood as a manifestation of universal psychic realities. This symbolic reading does not diminish the text's spiritual authority, expands it, revealing how the divine speaks in the language of the soul. By interpreting biblical symbols in psychological terms, we discover patterns of inner growth, conflict, and renewal that speak directly to the ongoing process of individuation. The journey toward becoming whole. Consider the tree of life and the tree of knowledge in Genesis. On the surface, they are part of the creation story, yet psychologically they represent two essential aspects of the human condition. The tree of life embodies the archetype of eternal vitality, the wholeness of existence that transcends time. The tree of knowledge represents the awakening of consciousness through differentiation, the ability to discern good from evil, self from other, light from darkness. To eat from the tree of knowledge is to step into the human journey of moral choice, self-awareness, and the confrontation with duality. In Jungian terms, this moment marks the emergence of ego consciousness from the undifferentiated unity of the unconscious, a step that is both a loss of innocence and the beginning of personal growth. Water, one of the most recurring biblical symbols, carries deep psychological resonance. In the story of Noah, in the crossing of the Red Sea, in the baptism of Jesus, water symbolizes the vast, formless depths of the unconscious, both life-giving and potentially overwhelming. To pass through water is to undergo a process of death and rebirth, in which old identities dissolve and new ones are formed. Jung saw such immersion in symbolic waters as an archetypal motif representing the dissolution of the ego's rigid boundaries, allowing transformation to take place. Baptism, in this light, becomes not only a ritual of faith but a profound psychic act of cleansing, surrender, and renewal. Light and darkness in the Bible are not merely moral opposites, they are psychological states that express the dynamics of consciousness. Let there be light is not only the creation of physical illumination but the archetypal moment of awareness breaking through unconscious chaos. Darkness, while often associated with evil or ignorance, also holds the unknown riches of the unconscious, the potential for new insight and creativity. Jung cautioned against an overly moralistic division of light as wholly good and darkness as wholly bad. Psychological integration requires us to recognize that both are necessary for growth. The Bible, in its more profound passages, reflects this truth. For example, in God's creative acts, beginning in darkness, or in the psalmist finding divine presence in the shadow of death. The desert or wilderness is another potent biblical symbol, appearing in the journeys of Moses, Elijah, John the Baptist, and Jesus. Psychologically, the wilderness is the place of stripping away, where familiar structures and comforts fall away and one confronts the raw forces of the self. It is a landscape of testing, temptation, and revelation, a metaphor for those periods in life when we feel lost, empty, or isolated, yet find in that emptiness the seeds of transformation. The 40 days in the wilderness, whether for Israel or for Christ, correspond to a necessary stage in the individuation process, in which the ego is purified and aligned with deeper aspects of the self. The temple and tabernacle carry immense symbolic weight as images of the ordered self. Their outer courts, inner chambers, and Holy of Holies mirror the layered structure of the psyche, moving from the outer world of conscious life into progressively more sacred and hidden realms, culminating in the direct presence of the divine. Psychologically, entering the Holy of Holies corresponds to moments when the conscious mind encounters the self, the unifying center of the psychic experiences of awe, insight, or deep inner peace. The destruction of the temple, in this light, symbolizes a psychic crisis in which the old order collapses, forcing a reorientation of life around a renewed or reimagined center. The serpent, so often misunderstood as a purely negative figure, embodies a complex archetype in biblical symbolism. In Eden, the serpent is the voice that introduces the possibility of choice and transformation, challenging the status quo. In the wilderness, Moses lifts the bronze serpent as a symbol of healing, suggesting that confrontation with the very source of danger can become a source of life. In psychological terms, the serpent represents instinctual energy, the capacity for renewal, and the shadow aspects of the psyche that, if integrated rather than repressed, can lead to healing and greater wholeness. Jung would argue that to reject the serpent entirely is to reject part of one's own transformative potential. Bread and wine, central to the rituals of both Old and New Testaments, are archetypal symbols of sustenance and transformation. In the manna of the wilderness and the bread of the Last Supper, we see the image of spiritual nourishment that sustains the journey through life's trials. Wine, with its association with joy, blood, and sacrifice, becomes a symbol of life's richness and the cost of transformation. In the Eucharist, bread and wine unite in a symbolic act of assimilation, taking into oneself the life and presence of the divine, a psychological image of integrating the deepest values and truths into the fabric of one's being. Fire, whether in the burning bush, the pillar of flame, or the tongues of Pentecost, symbolizes the dynamic and transformative energy of the spirit. Fire burns away impurity, illuminates darkness, and energizes action. In the psyche, it represents both the danger and necessity of passion, inspiration, and direct contact with the numinous. The biblical encounters with fire often involve a commissioning or sending forth, as when Moses is called to liberate Israel or the apostles are empowered to spread their message. Psychologically, fire moments are those in which one is seized by a vision or purpose that reshapes the trajectory of life. The shepherd and sheep imagery, so prevalent in the Psalms and in the teachings of Jesus, taps into deep archetypal themes of guidance, protection, and belonging. The shepherd is the figure of the wise guide, the self leading the ego through the dangers and confusions of life. The sheep, vulnerable yet trusting, represent the human need for direction and the courage to follow a trusted inner or outer guide. This image, repeated endlessly in art, hymns, and sermons, resonates because it mirrors an internal reality, the relationship between the guiding wisdom of the self and the often frightened, wandering aspects of the personality. The cross, perhaps the most central symbol in Christian tradition, is not only a historical instrument of execution but an archetype of profound psychological significance. It represents the intersection of opposites, heaven and earth, life and death, spirit and matand, the transformative power of suffering embraced willingly. Jung saw the cross as a Manda-like image of wholeness, in which the tension of opposites is held rather than avoided, leading to a new integration. In personal terms, the cross symbolizes the willingness to endure the death of the old self in order to make space for the birth of the new. Apocalyptic imagery, with its beasts, battles, and new heavens and earth, operates on a symbolic level as a portrayal of psychic upheaval and renewal. These visions depict the collapse of the old psychic order under the pressure of unconscious forces, followed by the emergence of a transformed reality. Jung noted that such imagery often appears in dreams during times of profound personal transition, reflecting the psyche's natural movement or reordering itself after chaos. The biblical apocalypse, in this sense, is not only about the end of the world but about the transformation of the individual and the collective soul. By interpreting these and countless other biblical symbols psychologically, we engage the text, not only as an artifact of faith but as a living dialogue with the deepest parts of ourselves. Symbols have the power to bypass the rigid defenses of the ego and speak directly to the unconscious, stirring emotions, memories, and insights that lead to transformation. In Jung's view, to work with these symbols consciously is to participate in the ongoing work of individuation, allowing the ancient wisdom of the Bible to illuminate the inner journey in ways that are as relevant now as they were in the days when the stories were first told. The Bible's influence on the moral and spiritual development of the individual is profound because it does not simply present abstract doctrines or distant laws. It engages the whole person, mind, heart, and spirit through stories, symbols, commands, poetry, and example. Across its pages, it offers a framework for shaping conscience, cultivating virtues, and confronting the inner conflicts that define human existence. In Jungian terms, it offers a guide for individuation, not only in the sense of self-realization but in the deeper sense of integrating the personality in harmony with the self, that central archetype representing wholeness. From early childhood, exposure to biblical narratives, proverbs, and parables can begin to plant seeds of moral imagination, influencing the ways people understand good and evil, justice and mercy, responsibility and grace. The moral shaping begins with its archetypal stories, which teach not through dry rules but through lived experience. The account of Cain and Abel, for example, is more than a warning against murder. It speaks to the destructive power of envy, the call to master one's impulses, and the consequences of failing to do so. This narrative invites the reader to see themselves in both brothers, the innocent who suffers unjustly and the one who struggles with darker urges, making the moral lesson not merely a set of rules to follow but an internal drama to confront. In this way, the Bible encourages self-examination, a crucial component in the development of a mature moral sense. Its moral teaching is also embedded in the covenantal structure of many of its narratives. The idea that relationships between God and humanity or between people are bound by mutual responsibility shapes the individual's understanding of ethical obligation. In the covenant with Israel, the law is given not as a cold list of demands but as part of a living relationship, in which obedience is a response to love and faithfulness. This relational model of morality encourages individuals to view their actions in light of how they affect others and the harmony of the whole community, reinforcing the archetype of the interconnected body where every member matters. The prophetic tradition in the Bible contributes to the moral and spiritual development of individuals by modeling the courage to confront injustice and call for repentance. Figures like Isaiah, Amos, and Micah do not speak in abstract philosophical terms. They challenge the powerful, defend the oppressed, and remind the people that ritual without righteousness is meaningless. Such voices encourage individuals to develop moral courage, to see beyond personal comfort and act for the greater good. Psychologically, these prophets embody the archetype of the conscience and inner voice that will not be silenced until the truth is acknowledged and lived. Wisdom literature deepens this moral shaping by focusing on the cultivation of virtues through reflection, discipline, and humility. The Book of Proverbs offers practical guidance on honesty, diligence, generosity, and restraint, creating a pattern of thought that shapes everyday decision-making. Ecclesiastes challenges the individual to face life's impermanence and apparent contradictions without falling into despair, encouraging a deeper trust in the rhythms of life. Job confronts the reality that suffering is not always a direct result of wrongdoing, inviting a more nuanced understanding of justice and faith. Together, these works teach that moral and spiritual growth is not static but an ongoing process that requires reflection, patience, and openness to life's complexities. The life and teachings of Jesus offer one of the most transformative models for moral and spiritual development. His Sermon on the Mount does not simply prescribe external behavior, it addresses the inner motivations of the heart. By teaching that anger is akin to murder in its seed form, that lust begins in the gaze and the imagination, and that love must extend even to enemies, Jesus points to the need for inner transformation, not just external compliance. This depth-oriented morality resonates with Jung's emphasis on integrating the shadow and purifying the inner life, recognizing that true change flows from within. His parables, too, work on the unconscious level, bypassing rational resistance and planting images that grow into lived virtues over time. Spiritual development in the biblical sense also involves a process of testing and perseverance. Stories, like the trials of Joseph, the exile of Daniel, or the missionary journeys of Paul, demonstrate that growth often comes through adversity. In psychological terms, these are the individuation crisis times when the ego's plans are disrupted, and the individual is forced to draw on deeper resources, discovering strength, resilience, and faith they might not have known they possessed. Such narratives encourage the reader to view hardships not only as obstacles but as catalysts for transformation. The Psalms contribute uniquely to the individual's inner life by giving voice to the full range of human emotions before God: joy, sorrow, anger, fear, gratitude, and hope. This honesty models emotional integration, showing that spiritual maturity does not require the repression of difficult feelings but their honest expression in the context of relationship with the divine. In Jungian language, the Psalms allow the conscious ego to engage with the unconscious in a healthy dialogue, preventing psychic fragmentation by giving expression to what might otherwise be buried or denied. Prayer and meditation, as modeled in the Bible, further shape the individual's moral and spiritual character. The Lord's Prayer, for example, encapsulates humility before God, dependence on divine provision, the centrality of forgiveness, and the desire for deliverance from evil. Regular engagement with such patterns of prayer trains the mind to orient itself toward higher values, to relinquish self-centeredness, and to cultivate a posture of gratitude and trust. Over time, these practices shape not only beliefs but the structure of the personality itself, making virtues like patience, kindness, and integrity more reflexive. The Bible also develops the moral imagination through its use of symbolic acts and rituals. Passover, with its remembrance of liberation from slavery, instills gratitude for freedom and a responsibility to extend that freedom to others. Baptism, symbolizing death and rebirth, reinforces the idea that transformation is possible and that one's past need not define one's future. Communion, with its shared meal, cultivates a sense of belonging and mutual responsibility within the community. These rituals engage the senses, emotions, and unconscious mind, embedding moral and spiritual truths more deeply than intellectual assent alone could achieve. Another key element in the Bible's impact on personal development is its call to love as the highest moral principle. The command to love God with all one's heart and to love one's neighbor as oneself integrates the vertical dimension of spirituality with the horizontal dimension of human relationship. This holistic approach ensures that moral growth is not reduced to legalism or self-interest, but is rooted in genuine care for others and alignment with the divine will. Love, in this sense, becomes both the motivation and the measure of moral and spiritual maturity. The Bible also challenges the individual to confront and integrate the darker aspects of the self that resist virtue and seek selfish gain. Through its honest portrayals of flawed heroes, David's adultery, Peter's denial, Jonah's resistance, it shows that moral failure is part of the human journey and that redemption is possible. This acknowledgement prevents the split between an idealized self-image and a repressed shadow, fostering greater honesty, humility, and empathy toward others. Jung saw this integration of the shadow as essential for true individuation, and the Bible offers numerous pathways for such integration through confession, repentance, and reconciliation. Forgiveness is another crucial area in which the Bible shapes the individual. Forgiveness in biblical terms is not merely a social courtesy, but a profound act of releasing the hold of resentment and re-establishing relationship. Stories like the reconciliation of Joseph with his brothers, or Jesus' forgiveness of those who crucified him, embody the transformative power of this act. Psychologically, forgiveness frees psychic energy previously bound in bitterness, opening the way for growth and deeper connection. The eschatological visions of the Bible, its promises of renewal, restoration, and a new creation, teleological pull for spiritual growth, they orient the individual toward hope, giving meaning to moral effort and endurance in the face of struggle. This future-oriented dimension reinforces the belief that one's present actions matter in the larger arc of history and eternity. Such hope is not escapism but a sustaining vision that empowers individuals to live with purpose and resilience. Through all of these elements, narrative, law, wisdom, prophecy, poetry, ritual, and vision, the Bible offers an integrated path for moral and spiritual development that engages the whole person. It does not promise a life free from conflict or failure. Rather, it equips individuals to navigate those realities with increasing depth, integrity, and compassion. It calls for the continual alignment of the outer life with the inner transformation of the heart, guiding the individual toward wholeness in both personal identity and relationship with the divine.